clearly SpongeBob is the guy. I mean, not only is he a titular character, like he's delightful. I think that the kids watching were meant to self-identify with SpongeBob. He's fun and funny and having a great time and like whatever. And he loves working. And like Mr. Krabs is like, no, you can't have a raise. And he's like, okay. Like he's always the employee of the month. Like he gets a lot of rewards for being a cog in the machine and doing it with a smile on his face. Have you ever had something you love dismissed because it's just pop culture? What others might deem stupid shit, you know matters. You know it's worth talking and thinking about. And so do we. So come overthink with us as we delve into our deep thoughts about stupid shit. I'm Tracie Guy Decker, and you're listening to Deep Thoughts About Stupid Shit because pop culture is still culture, and shouldn't you know what's in your head? On today's episode, I'll be sharing my deep thoughts about SpongeBob SquarePants with my sister, Emily Guy Birken, and with you. Let's dive in. All right, Em, I think I was into SpongeBob a lot more than you were, but tell me, what do you know or remember about SpongeBob SquarePants?
It's an iconic theme song. Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? You're right. I never really got into it. I have watched it with you. Famously, our parents said, like, if you weren't there, they didn't know when to laugh.
Yeah. They could only watch it with me because that's how they knew when to laugh. Yeah.
So I know SpongeBob more as a meme than I know SpongeBob as a cartoon that I watched, although I have certainly seen several episodes. The thing that you've mentioned several times, like 3 hours later, like that kind of thing. There's the meme of SpongeBob going, imagination, with the rainbow. Yeah, it's just kind of like low-level zeitgeist. Because I kind of missed it. You know, we were talking about before we started recording that it came out in 99 is when it started. And you were 23 and I was 20. And I think part of the difference was that I was still in college and you were post-college. So it was kind of a pain in the butt to watch TV.
Right.
And at the time, if I was going to spend my time watching TV, it was going to be the high holy Sunday night hour of X-Files. And so it kind of just passed me by. But I do know that there is a lot of like deep thought about this show. People have spent time thinking about this show. I know that it is just absolutely beloved by the kids who were little kids at the time, as well as like the elder millennials who were just younger than us. I'm not going to say I'm tabula rasa, but I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this because I don't have a whole heck of a lot of opinions about SpongeBob. So tell me, why are we talking about, our favorite sponge today?
Yeah. So as you say, post-college, I think, I mean, to be honest, I was too old. I was too old for it, but I babysat. That was one of the ways I made money in, grad school. And also I just love animation. And so I think I watched it initially, maybe with a babysitting client. I'm not sure, but I just loved it. Like I really loved it. And so now there are 15 seasons of this show, plus a bunch of movies. So I'm not talking about all of those things. And I did not stick around for the entire ride, but it was very, I loved it. I deeply loved it, when it was new, 99, 2000, those sort of years. And then when I was through grad school, through about 2005 or so, my daughter really loved it when she was little and binged it, watched most of the 15 seasons, and we've seen several movies together. And I definitely think that part of her sense of humor is influenced by SpongeBob SquarePants, maybe because of hearing me laugh at it. I don't know. So I think that's part of why I wanted to talk about it. It also was a big departure since we've done some heavy stuff lately, like Silence of the Lambs last week. So I wanted something a little bit lighter. But that's kind of why. And so let me give you a quick preview of where we're going before I can't do a synopsis of the whole show, but I'm going to give you the characters, I think. But before I do that, let me give you a little postcard from the destination. There are 4 main buckets that I want to talk about. They're unequal buckets. As you say, there's a lot of commentary about this show. A lot of it focuses on actually money. So there's a lot of Marxist or pseudo-Marxist analysis of this show because there's very clear class distinctions among the characters, and their attitudes toward money and toward work are central to plots often. So we're going to talk about that. And I'm seeing that of the sort of amateur analysis, like what we do, there are those who say that this show radicalized a generation to become in the direction of socialism. But there are others who claim that this show really was a tool of capitalism and taught us to, accept less than what we're worth and just become cogs in the machine.
Be good little workers.
Yeah. People are saying both extremes about this show. So I want to unpack a little bit what the tools are that people are pointing to. I'm interested to get your brain on the case a little bit too, especially as a relatively blank slate, because you're a money nerd. And then to have me sort of tell you the stuff, I'm looking forward to hearing what, your contribution to that piece. The second bucket that I want to talk about is gender and sexuality. This bucket is a little bit lighter than the money one. It's a little bigger than a thimble, but maybe it's a cup.
It's a shot glass.
It's a cup. I think the sexuality piece, I would argue that SpongeBob himself is heteroromantic, but asexual. So whatever. But I do think that there's some interesting things, interesting examples of different forms of masculinity and what the judgment is of the show of those different forms of masculinity is something that's worth kind of at least lifting up. We won't spend a lot of time there. I want to talk about, this will be a little bit related to our conversations around the movie Big, about adulting and the importance of play and the importance of imagination. That episode, actually, I rewatched that from that meme that you're talking about. And just being open to wonder that we get through the person of SpongeBob and Patrick Star, and kind of the messages. And that will segue into my final bucket, because since I watched this as starting as a 23-year-old and then, through my 20s, in a lot of ways, I identified closely with Squidward, who was the adult of the three main protagonists. I'm putting quotes around the word adult because they're all technically adults. And also he the show really gives him a hard time, if you will, about being an adult. And yet he was the one I was kind of identifying with. So it was a fun challenge to me, not in a finger wagging way, but just as a reminder. But I wasn't who the show was made for. That's a really interesting thing as I kind of move into my fourth bucket, which is about the animation itself and the art form and the storytelling pieces of it. I think that Steven Hillenburg, the creator, like me, very influenced by Ren and Stimpy. It's clear to me that he is indebted to John Kay, who was a sexual predator, but also made some great cartoons.
Really genius animator in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's clear to me that the creators and writers and animators of SpongeBob watched Ren and Stimpy religiously and studied it. And it's in that same arc of returning to a auteur, if you wish, of the animation, and pushed it even further to things that I find deeply funny, where they will intersperse photographs in with the animation. I'll tell a specific story about that.
I can remember you telling me about that in the early 2000s, about something that it just struck you as so funny.
Still really does.
The singing at the beginning,
right. With there's a painting of a pirate, but the mouth
but
is
it's a real person's
of an actual mouth.
Yeah.
Are you ready, kids? And in that, so also in the series open, SpongeBob kind of bounces, he opens his door and he's wearing just underpants, tighty whities, and this actual hand reaches in and puts his SquarePants on him, from the side, the animator, if you imagine the animator's hand coming in, which I find absolutely delightful. And so, part of the conversation about the actual art form too, and the influence of Hillenburg and others, I'm guessing those guys are Gen X. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is a Gen Z staple that Gen Xers made. Mm-hmm. And so there's something really interesting to me about that too. When we think, which harkens back to other things like Dirty Dancing, which was a boomer story, but a Gen X touchstone, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's where we're going. Before we get there, let me remind you, listener, or tell you if you haven't heard, some of the key players in this show. Again, it's 15 seasons. It's not a singular story arc, so I'm not going to try. But I'll just name the players, and I might give a few synopses of specific episodes as we go. But so SpongeBob SquarePants is the show. That's the name of the show. It's also a character. It's set in Bikini Bottom, which is the name of an underwater town populated by sea creatures. So SpongeBob is a sponge, and he lives on a little street. There are only 3 houses, apparently. His is a pineapple. Right next to him is what looks like a tiki head, I guess. And then right next to that is a rock. So the tiki head is Squidward's house, Squidward Tentacles, who is a squid, and is definitely the most like adult of the 3 of them. Under the rock lives Patrick Star, who's a starfish. SpongeBob and Patrick both wear pants, but no shirt. Squidward wears a shirt, but no pants.
Doesn't SpongeBob have a snail that's a cat named Gary?
Yes. SpongeBob has a pet who's a snail, whose name is Gary, and Gary meows like a cat. Yes. Squidward and SpongeBob both work at a fast food restaurant called the Krusty Krab, which is owned by Mr. Krabs, who is a crab, and is extremely like money focused. And he's very greedy, and like he has this thing where like he can smell money and he loves money. Like that's his entire personality pretty much, is that he loves money. And he runs the Krusty Krab like really to maximize profit. He doesn't care about the customers. He does not care about his workers. He just cares about money. That is made very clear. He has a daughter named Pearl, who is a whale.
Adopted? Okay.
They never say. Squidward hates working. He just works to live. SpongeBob loves working. He's the fry cook, and he loves it. Like, he just thinks it's the bee's knees. In fact, like, the very first episode, one of the things we see is, like, he's gonna go try and get a job at the Krusty Krab. So, other characters include SpongeBob and Patrick's friend Sandy, who is a squirrel, like an actual squirrel from the land. So she wears a diving outfit and helmet underwater, but she has a dome with a tree in it where she actually lives. That's like, imagine like an underwater base that they built. It's sort of shaped like an igloo with like a lock system that drains the water so you can take your helmet off. There's also Mrs. Puff, who is a driving instructor. She's a pufferfish. She's very nervous. And Plankton, who is tiny, and he owns the Chum Bucket, which is another restaurant across the street from the Krusty Krab, which is always failing. And Plankton is always trying to steal the secret formula for Krabby Patties, which makes them irresistible so that he can be a successful restaurateur. So there's this big rivalry, and he's always failing. There are probably other characters. Like, there's Larry the Lobster, who's a bodybuilder, and, you know, there's a couple of other recurring characters, but those are the main ones. Let me start with the money and Marxism piece, and I'll give a little bit more of maybe some of the, like, that first episode which is the first time that, so each episode, much like Ren and Stimpy, it's like a 30-minute episode with 2 15-minute mini episodes or half episodes. So you'll talk about and each one is named. Each of the 15-minute ones is named. So sometimes you'll see something, it'll be like season 2, episode 13B, which means it's the second half of the episode, is that storyline. So one of the two in the very first episode is when SpongeBob gets his job at the Krusty Krab. And he's like really excited to try and go get this job. And it's the first time we hear him say, "I'm ready," which is not just "I'm ready." It's "I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready," which I will sometimes say to you. And if you didn't know that where it came from, that's where it comes from.
I had no idea. Oh my goodness. That's helpful now.
For 20 years, I've been saying this to my sister, you guys, and she didn't know that I was quoting SpongeBob. That's fantastic. Okay. So he goes to get this job and like Patrick is encouraging him, you can do this. And then he gets there and Squidward's like, oh no. Like Squidward does not want his next door neighbor working with him at the Krusty Krab. And so Mr. Krabs gives him an impossible task to go buy this like super fancy spatula that Mr. Krabs has just made up that, you know, supposedly doesn't exist, and not to come back until he has it. And when he does, then he can have the job. So of course he goes off and he gets it. But in the meantime, 4 busloads of anchovies show up to the Krusty Krab, and they're like literally like a sea that the two other characters, like Mr. Krabs and Squidward, are just kind of like floating on the sea of anchovies who are hungry and rude. And some of the jokes are like so funny to me that I don't understand why they're so funny. Like Mr. Krabs, the buses pull up and his eye twitches and he says, "Do you smell that? It's a smelly smell that smells smelly." And like for some reason I find that hilarious. Do you smell that? It's a smelly smell that smells.
It's that sophisticated sense of humor.
Yeah, I'm so clever. So, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know SpongeBob swoops in with this fancy spatula and like almost magically makes enough Krabby Patties to feed all these anchovies and saves the day. And so, of course, he gets the job, much to Squidward's chagrin, because Squidward finds him really annoying. Those attitudes, like Krabs is delighted because they've just made so much money from all these anchovies buying all the Krabby Patties. Squidward is annoyed, and SpongeBob is just like happy to be of service. And so those characteristics, like that describes so many episodes. Krabs is delighted because there's money. Squidward is annoyed and bored and put out in one way or another. SpongeBob is just happy. Happy to be working, happy to be of service. It's very clear that they are underpaid. I think there's one time I'm aware of, it's possible there are more, but there's one time that I'm aware of where SpongeBob says, "Hey, Mr. Krabs, can I have a raise?" And Mr. Krabs is like, "No." And that's the end of the conversation. So, like, we're meant to know that they're underpaid. Clearly overworked. Sometimes we see it directly where, like, Mr. Krabs says we're going to be open 24 hours now, and there are literally 2 employees. Like, not 2 a shift, 2. There's Squidward and SpongeBob. So, like, we're meant to know that they're overworked and underpaid. And SpongeBob is just like, yeah, this is what we do. You know, and Squidward is like, huh. And so I see why the amateur analysts are saying, like, both of the things that they're saying, right? Both that this radicalized a generation who are like, yeah, I'm not doing that. And also that it was like kind of conveying the message of like, be a good worker. Because clearly SpongeBob is the guy. I mean, not only is he a titular character, like he's delightful. I think that the kids watching were meant to self-identify with SpongeBob. He's fun and funny and having a great time and like whatever. And he loves working. And like Mr. Krabs is like, no, you can't have a raise. And he's like, okay. Like he's always the employee of the month. Like he gets a lot of rewards for being a cog in the machine and doing it with a smile on his face. Though he is also made fun of. Like, right? Like Krabs and Squidward both think he's kind of ridiculous. It's like complicated. The fact that SpongeBob is the main character and is so happy to be a worker. He's happy. It's his dream. It's the finest eating establishment in all of Bikini Bottom. And that's why he wants to work there. And there's almost this like prodigal nature of his fry cookery, you know, that he was like born to be a fry cook. He's treated as if he's a chef in some ways, like because of the sort of prodigal kind of, you know, prodigy kind of thing. But he's not wearing a chef's hat, right? He's wearing like the Krusty Krab uniform and he's just slinging burgers. Like, even though he's sort of made to seem as though this is some special gift. And the fact that, like, again, Krabs, we see again and again and again that money is his only motivator and he's not sharing it with his employees. But SpongeBob remains happy with the circumstances. that's what those who sort of say, like, this is the tool of capitalism that was trying to indoctrinate youngins to be good workers, that's the evidence that they provide.
Here's what I'm hearing. It was around then, like late 90s, early 2000s, when I first heard from our uncle in Orlando, find something you love to do and you'll never work a day in your life, which I've heard many, many times since. And it very much seems like we are seeing with SpongeBob and Squidward, like the two sides of that, which is a very capitalist kind of way of looking at things in some ways. Like, so, find something you love to do. You'll never work a day in your life. I really hate that advice. I don't fault our uncle for telling me that. And I don't think that it's necessarily bad advice in a better world than the one we live in. Except that nobody loves digging ditches. And that needs to be done. I love what I do. I love what I do. There are days when it is work. So the idea that, like, SpongeBob loving what he does is decoupled from how much he's paid for it is, I think, kind of like a Marxist idea, in that, like, you're not doing work because you're getting paid for it. You're doing work because the work needs to be done, because it fulfills something in you, because you're good at it. All of those things that would be kind of like the idea of communism. Squidward being right there shows, like, why that doesn't work necessarily. But also why capitalism is not great, because you get these exploited workers, one of whom is happy to be exploited, the other one who is just doesn't have any other good choices. Mm-hmm. So I can definitely see where someone could say, like, yeah, this is upholding the status quo. But I can also see, before we started recording, I was saying, like, this is Gen Z. We're watching this as, like, the eldest Gen Z, the ones who are now in the workforce, and who, like, it makes my heart sing that they are saying to their bosses, what do you mean you want me to work past 5? You only pay me till 5. Or, no, I'm not answering the phone on the weekend. Like, no, which I am so proud to see, because it never occurred to me that I could do that when I was their age.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is something to, like, they grew up imbibing this and seeing that SpongeBob is there because he wants to be there, and Squidward is there because he has to be there.
There's something really, really interesting about Squidward in particular. Squidward is driven by status, despite the fact that he has very little. He's a total snob. He's a culture snob. So he plays the clarinet poorly and thinks of himself as being, like, very important, like a creative genius of some kind, right? Like, he really wants to be viewed in that way. So he not only does he play the clarinet, like, he paints and, like, whatever, and he has this big rivalry with this other squid named Squilliam.
That is amazing. Why is that so delightful?
Squilliam looks just like Squidward, but, like, has like a unibrow, and is much more, like, externally successful. So in one of the most beloved episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants, it's called Band Geeks. And Squilliam calls Squidward up and says, my band is supposed to play at the Bubble Bowl 2 Fridays from now or whatever it is, but I can't do it because I'm going to be out of town. So I thought maybe you and your band want to do it. And of course, Squid doesn't have a band. But he lies and says that he does, and tries to get a band together in Bikini Bottom. And actually, one of the funniest lines, too, in this episode, he gets all these people together, fish, together in this, I don't know, abandoned factory or something. And he says, has anyone played an instrument before? And Patrick Star raises his hand and says, does mayonnaise count as an instrument? I don't know why I find that so funny. Anyway, so, like, the whole motivation for Squidward to do this, to try and pull his marching band together, is to show up Squilliam that he's not a failure. And what's interesting is that I think the reason I'm bringing this to the fore in terms of what you were just talking about is, again, like what motivates us, right? Like we're clearly meant to think that this is the wrong reason. Like there's a lot of secondhand embarrassment on the part of Squidward and it is not working. And then finally, like SpongeBob gives this like rousing speech where he's like, Larry, when you had that accident, who was it that revived you? And he was like, the EMT guy. And like so-and-so, when that happens, what did a guy on the street, like it's not Squidward. Like the answer is not Squidward. And SpongeBob somehow manages to be like, well, let's do it for those guys. So they pull together this amazing band that like knocks the socks off of everyone, including Squilliam. And so Squidward gets rewarded. Like he gets what he wants, even though I think we are meant to know that it's for the wrong reasons. It's, I mean, we're even told it's for the wrong reasons. Like SpongeBob doesn't rally the troops for Squidward. But Squidward still like reaps the benefit of it. So it's like this really interesting sort of push-pull that, and this episode is deeply beloved. Like when I did a search for like funniest SpongeBob episodes, like this comes up in every single list. And it's got this like status, like keeping up with the Joneses or keeping up with Squilliam in this case, at its core, which again, like to your point about working because you love it or working because you have to, like what is the motivation? Like I do think that Hillenburg and the other creators were really interested in some of those questions about motivation.
And also even what you're describing, how SpongeBob like rallies the troops is by saying, let's do this for these other people who helped you. That gets into this Marxist ideal as well, where it's communal, but also gets into the idea that to each their own ability. So like the EMT guy is who helped Larry because that's what he's good at. I think it's really interesting that Squidward is unhappy because he's status obsessed. Mr. Krabs is money obsessed, and those are like kind of two sides of the same coin.
Yes, completely, yes.
And whereas SpongeBob's just happy, as is Patrick, if I remember correctly. There is something to like taking pride in humble work, which is status quo supporting.
The thing, though, I think, like when we talk about status and money, though, like the episode that gave us the meme with the imagination with the rainbow is called The Idiot Box. SpongeBob and Patrick order a TV for the box. They throw the TV away, a giant television that they throw away so that they can have this big box to play in. And Squidward is, lives between the two of them. So he's like, can I have the TV? And like, he's like super excited to have this giant TV. Meanwhile, SpongeBob and Patrick close themselves in the box and are playing different games. And the sound effects from them are like really believable. So much so that Squidward is like, what are you doing? Do you have a sound tape recorder in there? Like, how are you doing that? Like they're playing Mountain Climber and like he hears the sound of the avalanche and he gets really scared and he opens the box to see if they're okay. And they're just sitting there like blinking at him. And Squidward's like, how are you doing that? And that's when SpongeBob's like, it's our imagination. And he does the rainbow thing that you've seen in the meme. And he goes back into his house and he's trying to watch the TV. And every show is something about boxes, how boxes are made, or like, and then it even's like a boxing match. And he's like, well, it's not actually boxing, but then they're like boxes moving around a boxing ring. It's so ridiculous. So there's definitely sort of that, like, again, that sense of like, what is the motivation? Like these two guys, Patrick and SpongeBob, they don't need money. They don't need status. They got their box. They got their imaginations, like, and they are happy. And that's true, like, over and over and over again. So that episode is, like, explicit. But also, like, when they love going jellyfishing. So they have nets, like, think like butterfly nets, but to catch jellyfish. And then they just throw them back and they're, like, frolicking. Like, they play. Like, that's their thing. What's interesting to me, one of the many things that are interesting, in that episode in particular, in the Idiot Box, Squidward, like, he's having FOMO. about all the noises he's hearing coming out of the box. And so he joins them and they say, well, where do you want to go? And he's like, I don't know, like a robot pirate island, like trying to come up with the most ridiculous thing. And then they do it and like he's not seeing it. He's just sitting there in a box with these two guys. And so he like gets frustrated and leaves. And they keep playing and then he hears the sound effects and it sounds like Robot Pirate Island. He's like major FOMO. So he waits for them to go to sleep and then gets in the box and is looking for like the button or the lever or the whatever, like how they were making the noise. And eventually like he's like, it's not like if I could just press my foot like this, I'll be driving a race car. And then there's the sound of a race car. And he's like, hey, I'm finally doing it. I'm finally doing it. And SpongeBob hears from his house like, oh, he's finally doing it. Well, it turns out it's actually like a trash truck that's picking up the big box. And like Squid's like having a great time because he feels the box moving. And he's like, my imagination is working. He gets dumped in the dump and like falls down this hill of trash. So it's like there's something really, there's a tension that's alive for me in that, insofar as I feel like we are being clearly shown that Squidward is limiting himself by his kind of adult, I'm putting quotes around that, his adult perspective. His cynicism and his like negativity are limiting him. And even when he finally lets himself, it's not really him. Like it's not real. Like even his imagination is not real. Like his experience is actually this trash truck. So there's something like, there's like a tension that's real about whether or not Squidward has access, is able to access the motivation that we are clearly shown is like more fun, more desirable, like what we should be aiming for. Like we should be aspiring to be SpongeBob and Patrick. But even when Squidward lets himself, he pays for it.
Mm-hmm. This is feeling a little like there's a connection to Big. I see that when Josh gets his first paycheck and he's like, $135 or whatever it was.
Yeah, 187.
Yeah. Like there's a childlike enjoyment and childlike joy and wonder and imagination that you see with SpongeBob. And it's in part because he is not obsessed with the adult status type stuff that I can't remember the not villain. Yeah, well, Squidward, but yeah.
Oh,
but
Plankton?
No, in Big. The the rival guy.
Paul.
There's that. But there's also like there's more, I think, sympathy for Squidward in this situation.
So that's a really interesting point too, because yes, I agree. In particular, like again, since I started watching this as an adult, like I identified with Squidward a lot of the time, you know, like I'm sure the kids who were watching it, like the kids I was babysitting, were not identifying as Squidward, but I was, you know, and so there's also like a really interesting kind of tension there in that when I think about what I named before, that like I think Hillenburg and the other makers were Gen Xers like me. I'm watching it identifying with Squidward, you know, and like looking for ways that I can like not make those mistakes, but totally understanding them, understanding the status, understanding the FOMO, understanding the like, oh no, Squilliam. You know, like I can't let Squilliam know I work at a fast food restaurant. You know, like really getting that in ways that I have a feeling like the kids I was babysitting for whom it was I guess, you know, officially made, like probably weren't getting, you know, from life experience. So there's something really like, yes, I completely agree. There's a lot more sympathy for Squidward than there was for Paul in Big. Yeah. Yeah.
So something I have spent some time thinking about. My spouse and I have talked about like where we went to college. And the first college he chose for a reason that I can't wrap my head around. And I was like thinking like I wouldn't do that. Except that when I first went to visit my alma mater, Kenyon, I wanted to cross it off my list because it wasn't prestigious enough. And like, I feel really lucky that I have this like core sense of like who I am. And like, I stepped on campus. I'm like, well, I'm home. So that's it. And I had a couple of pangs of like, I had someone say to me when I applied, I had someone I went to high school with like, oh, like you're not going to get into Kenyon, because I was going to school with people who were applying to Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Duke and blah, blah, blah. And so that kind of like social conditioning for like prestige. And even like my first job out of college, I worked at Barnes & Noble, and then I ended up getting an office job that was awful, but it was an office job. So that's like real work instead of retail, which is not real work. So like and I don't know if that's just Gen X or if that is millennials have felt that too or what. And if that's part of what we're seeing with like elder Gen Z, like saying, no. about work.
Yeah.
I don't know, but that I think is like, it's really interesting because what they're growing up watching is just be who you are and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, actually, like on that point of like be who you are and the status stuff, I'm gonna shift into gender a little bit. So I'm not going to say this like never in 15 seasons ever passes Bechdel, but in general, it doesn't. So there certainly are more than 2 female characters, but they're almost never together. It's not a regular thing that they would be together. And if they were, like if Mrs. Potts and Sandy talked, they would probably be talking about SpongeBob. It's entirely possible that it's more than one point in the 15 seasons that like Pearl and Sandy spoke about something besides SpongeBob or a man, but in general, no. So a reminder, Bechdel is, are there at least 2 female characters? Do they talk to each other? Do they talk to each other about something other than a man? 2 named female characters. So I'm saying like in general, no, this franchise doesn't, like they don't set it up that happens on the regular. And I think there's still some really interesting things that happen around gender. So Sandy is the most frequent airtime female character, and she's a badass, right? She's a squirrel who lives under the sea. And they first meet when SpongeBob first meets Sandy, she's like wrestling this giant clam, and they like do karate together, SpongeBob and she do, and like this clam eats SpongeBob. He's trying to save Sandy, but ends up like getting eaten. And she's like, hold on, little yellow dude. Because she's from Texas. And she like beats the heck out of this clam who like flies off like whimpering. Like she is tough, real tough. And she's wearing this like diver's suit. But then in her dome, she wears like a little like mini skirt and like bandeau. So she's very much female. You know, like girly girl to a certain extent, but also tough as nails. So that's really kind of interesting. She's clearly SpongeBob's romantic interest. Though, again, I have to say, I think SpongeBob is pretty much asexual and has something going on with Patrick. I don't know. They're like best friends, you know? So like it's complicated. Like I'm actually not making any comments on sexuality. On gender, like Sandy's really interesting. And like SpongeBob, who is our beloved protagonist, is like really physically weak. So they go to like Muscle Beach at Goo Lagoon, and like Larry the Lobster, like there's all of this, they're like lifting weights and stuff. And like SpongeBob is lifting like a stick with marshmallows on the end of it and struggling. You know, like, and Sandy's like deadlifting these huge weights, and like Larry's like deadlifting like the bleachers with all the fish and people in them, like on either side of a stick. And like SpongeBob is like struggling with these marshmallows. So like we are meant to understand that this little yellow dude is not very strong. And like we laugh at him, but we laugh with him, kind of. It's much gentler kind of like laughing at him than I think it could be, especially with the kind of like emasculating in the traditional sense weakness. Except that then he splits his pants while he's trying to lift and everybody laughs, and he loves that he's making everybody laugh. So he starts splitting his pants all the time. I actually had to stop watching that episode because I couldn't handle the secondhand embarrassment.
You and I are particularly
particularly sensitive to that.
Sensitive to secondhand embarrassment.
But so we have Larry the Lobster, who's like super buff and like also just like a cool dude. Like he's neither villainized nor is he idealized as like a, like it's not like the hyper masculinity is something that becomes something we're meant to like wish for. It's just one way of being.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is pretty cool. And I wonder if that also contributes to sort of the ways in which Gen Zers are just a lot more comfortable with different expressions of gender, like on that spectrum, right? That one doesn't have to be Larry the Lobster in order to be male. One can be SpongeBob and still be male. I think that's really cool. And like, it's unfortunate that like Sandy was kind of our only option, or Pearl, who's very, again, those opposites, because she's a very girly girl. Pearl is the whale daughter of the crab, like super into like, she's like cheerleader, like kind of traditional feminine, like hyper feminine kind of expressions, but huge because she's a whale. So it's like, outside of Bikini Bottom, we might think that those things were mutually exclusive. And in Bikini Bottom, it's like, no, it's just, that's how Pearl is, That's who Sandy is. So those things are pretty cool. We're running out of time, so I want to talk about the actual like art form a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So use of real like live action or still photographs within the animation is done regularly, but not so much, in my opinion, that it becomes sort of a shtick that you're like, oh yeah, that again. And done to such comedic effect. Like in that first episode, when SpongeBob first meets Sandy, she says, "How are you with air?" And he doesn't know what she's saying. So he gets invited over to her dome, her tree dome, and he asks Patrick, what's air? And he says, do you mean putting on airs? That just means being fancy. You have to put your pinky up. So SpongeBob goes to Sandy's dome and like starts to realize what air is. And he's like starting to dry out and his voice gets all funny. He's like, what's wrong with water? It's really bizarre. And then Patrick sees him like trying to get out and so Patrick like rushes in and is like, no, you can't quit. And he's like taking him back to the table so that they can have lunch together. And he dries out and they get really dried out. And then we cut to a photograph of a yellow kitchen sponge next to a little pink starfish. It's a photograph. And I've seen this before, but like a couple of nights ago, I'm watching this and I'm laughing so hard. I'm almost crying at this photograph of a yellow kitchen sponge and a pink starfish in the midst of this thing where they're like, water's for quitters. And then Patrick's like, pinky up because of Jenny Pants. Oh man. Anyway, so where I wanted to go with this though was this sort of like not being afraid to push the bounds of the medium, which I think in many ways, again, is indebted to Ren and Stimpy and those animators who came before, but is not derivative of. Like they're not rehashing the same thing that Ren and Stimpy did. They're doing it in new and interesting ways. And sometimes it falls flat. Like there's one episode, I don't remember which one it is. Like I actually like the episode, but it starts with this like Patches the Pirate live action thing with this parrot on like parrot marionette. It's really, that bit is really stupid. And I think it's meant to be like, like Captain Kangaroo here in the DMV when we were kids, where there was like a live action thing that would introduce a cartoon show. Like I think it's meant to kind of harken back to that. But that to me fell flat. Like pushing the medium and like being nostalgic and stuff. But then in other times, like at one point they have to run a gauntlet on a haunted pirate ship and it's the perfume counter. And we actually see like video of an actual like perfume counter. That's hilarious. So I guess that, and then they have a narrator. Like I think a lot of kids' senses of humor were very much influenced by things like that, right? Like I've mentioned before on other episodes where my daughter sometimes, if something's taking too long, she will put on this weird French accent, which is the narrator from SpongeBob, and say, 2 hours later. And it's hilarious.
Yeah.
And she got that from SpongeBob. And that's like baked into her humor DNA, which I think is really, really interesting. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of the things that are baked in, but I think, again, we have said this so many times on Deep Thoughts, but one of the things that I think the SpongeBob folks did well and why it still holds up these 25 years later or whatever is that they took the medium deeply seriously, but they didn't take themselves seriously, and they were willing to break the rules if it had certain effects. And so I think that's one of the things that makes it as long-lasting as it's been.
You know, it's interesting, the way you're putting that, willing to break the rules, is kind of what I feel like we're seeing with willing to break the rules if it serves the humor or the story. I feel like that's what we're seeing with the Gen Zers who are like, yeah, I'm not doing that at work. Like, they're willing to break the rules because it serves their needs.
Something else. Yeah, it serves a greater purpose.
Yeah.
That's really
Whereas
interesting.
we were like, no, these are the rules. The rules are the rules. You got to follow the rules because the rules are the rules.
This is a cartoon. You can't put live action in a cartoon.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is the sort of thing that's why we do what we're doing, which is like, where are these like kind of, I won't say universal, but like widespread changes and differences between generations coming from? And like, I get a little frustrated with how much we talk about generations. Like they name Gen Alpha before they're even done being born. It's like, stop. Like, they need to have like shared experiences, shared media, shared a bunch of stuff. And if they're not even all born yet, then what's the point? But there is something to when they get to be, you know, young adults and the older adults are like kids these days about, you know, working with them. What is it that they're going to have in common?
Yeah. All right. Well, we're running out of time. So let me see if I can reflect back some of the highlights of what we talked about. SpongeBob, y'all, is still really, really funny. So the key buckets that I brought today were like attitudes toward money and kind of Marxist analysis thereof, money and work. And we actually extended that out to status. And I think where we landed was actually talking about motivation and what motivates us, and naming that SpongeBob sort of showed us that like intrinsic motivation, like SpongeBob works because he likes the work and he is therefore happy. And he is not driven by status. He is not driven by money. He's not even, I mean, there are moments when he cares about how others think about him. But even in that, like, as long as, like, when he's making people laugh, he's happy too. You know, even that he can't lift what Larry the lobster can lift, but when he makes people laugh, that makes him happy. So there's like a way in which, like, we're shown that relationships, imagination, fun, play, all are like great motivators, and status and money are not. Squidward is so unhappy all the time, and he has a hard time even accessing the things that make SpongeBob happy because he's doing it for the wrong reasons. We talked a bit about gender. I put sexuality on the shelf because it's complicated and I actually don't want to get into it that much. But I did talk about gender. The show in general does not pass the Bechdel test, but it does give us really like non-judgmental different modes of masculinity in particular, from very weak SpongeBob, physically weak, to very strong Larry, who aren't idealized or demonized for either of those things. That's just how they show up. We also saw sort of what outside of Bikini Bottom I named like the whale, who is also very feminine, would, based on some of what society has taught us about fat phobia and femininity, would say that that's impossible. But there's Pearl. That's just who she is. And similarly, Sandy, who is a total badass, very physically strong, very physically fierce, and also feminine. We get both with Sandy. I talked a bit about like some of the generational like switching and swapping and humor, insofar as like this was Gen Xers making stuff for Gen Zers and younger potentially, and like some of the humor things we have therefore passed on through this show, like my daughter's 2 hours later, and also breaking the rules a little bit or breaking the fourth wall occasionally. the ways in which I experienced this show when it was new, like kind of like self-identifying as Squidward, who was like the quote unquote adult, even though they're all technically adults, and the ways in which it felt like a reminder versus like kids I was babysitting who are now adults who would have self-identified probably as SpongeBob or possibly Patrick. And then we also talked a bit about the art form of animation and the cartoon and the ways in which building off of some of the groundbreaking work that Ren and Stimpy did in terms of like reclaiming animation as its own art form, not just as marketing for products, but as its own art form, that this kind of builds on that work that Ren and Stimpy did and even expands it by continuing to break the rules. I name specifically by bringing in like still photos or video from the real world, which we see even from the opening sequence where we've got the pirate painting with an actual man's lips asking if you're ready, kids, and also the like animator's hand with the SquarePants over SpongeBob's tighty whities. So those were the big highlights of what I think we talked about. What did I miss, Em?
I think we talked a little bit about how, so you mentioned that money and status are bad motivators, but we talked about how like that could be the way that SpongeBob treats work could be seen as like upholding the status quo in some ways, or it could be like a Marxist pushback in some ways. I think it's complicated. I think it's a yes and in part because it's been made by like the Gen Xers who were like, oh, the boss wants me to work late. Okay, I'm working late. So we struggle with breaking those rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why we see commentators saying both things about this franchise. They say both that it radicalized a generation around work and that it taught us to be good little workers. We see both things being said. And I see why. People draw those conclusions. I mean, from the art itself, I think we would have to look at data, whether quantitative or qualitative, to know what the actual impact was. So, well, that's what I wanted to say about SpongeBob SquarePants, who lives in a pineapple under the sea. So, next weekend?
Next time I will be bringing you my deep thoughts about The Mummy, the Brendan Fraser film.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Can't wait. See you then.
This show is a labor of love, but that doesn't make it free to produce. If you enjoy it even half as much as we do, please consider helping to keep us overthinking. You can support us at our Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. Or leave a positive review so others can find us. And of course, share the show with your people. Thanks for listening. Our theme music is Professor Umlaut by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com. Find full music credits in the show notes.
Thank you to Resonate Recordings for editing today's episode.
Until next time, remember, pop culture is still culture. And shouldn't you know what's in your head?